De eerste spreker is een Brits auteur. Hij gaat het hier hebben over massale immigratie op Europa. Dames en heren, geef hem een groot applaus. Niemand minder dan Douglas Murray.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I normally say thank you very much for that very kind introduction, but I have no idea what you just said about me. It could have been anything, so I'll assume it was a kind introduction, and thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been given 15 minutes or so, and then I've got to get on a plane to go back to London. But I'm going to talk to you for about 10 minutes, if that's okay, because I've asked if I could have 5 minutes for 2 or 3 very scintillating, provocative, as difficult as you like questions, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Let me say just first of all, I've been coming to your country, the Netherlands, for maybe just under 20 years now. And let me tell you a little bit, because an interesting thought for people like me often is, what's somebody's first political memory? And as you get a little bit older, you discover that people's political memories start to surprise you. You discover people whose first political memory doesn't include, say, 9/11. You discover people whose first political memory didn't include some of the big events that happened in this country. I started coming to this country at a time when, in my view, this country was in a really very, very bad situation. In the early 2000s, and you'd had the murder of Pim Fortuyn, the murder of Theo van Gogh, and as far as I could see it, everybody I knew in the Netherlands feeling either under a physical, very serious threat, or, and this was even more common in wider society here, a deep, deep fear of thinking or saying the wrong thing. And that was everywhere. It was people in politics who would say one thing in public and then in private would say, well, you know. And it was ordinary men and women I met across this country. People were fearful. Everyone may think something, but nobody should say it. And I used to write pieces in those days, in the early 2000s, about this country, describing it, it was a cliche in a way, describing it as a canary in the coal mine. It was often used at that time. What's happening in the Netherlands is a warning. And that's true, by the way. I think that remains true. But in the period since then, I've been traveling even more widely across our entire continent. And despite Brexit, I do still think of this as our continent. There's a great tendency in my country at the moment that if you voted Leave like I did, you also have to say something like, but you know, I love European culture. And you go, only a maniac would say the opposite. Oh, I hate European culture. What a bore. But in any case, obviously this is still our continent. And I've been writing and thinking and traveling a lot in recent years because I think we need to think about a lot of very deep issues that are going on underneath us. And very, very few people in politics or journalism want to look at the deeper levels. So I wrote this book, The Strange Death of Europe, which was the result of travels all across our continent, from migrant camps of the southern European Mediterranean countries to all across Scandinavia, all across Germany, all across our continent. And I said I wanted to try to think deeply about the issues that people don't want to think about. Very, very difficult questions, which we're all mulling over all the time. For instance, who does Europe belong to? Who can it be for? Who can it not be for? What are our limits as societies? If we're very tolerant and we're very proud of being tolerant, what are the points at which we say we won't have that? Can we even do that? Can we even start to have that conversation? Now, all sorts of things I could tell you that I came across in that book and I describe in that book, and I think there are copies at the back for anyone who's interested in. I often say, people say, I've read your book. I say, I don't mind whether you've read my book. Have you bought my book? It's very much more important. But both is good. But this book tries to, among other things, shoot down a lot of the lies that your generation and my generation have heard on a whole set of issues. And I say, just take the migration issues every single day, and it still happens in the Dutch media, still happens in all of our media. You hear sets of lies that are so clearly untrue by now. But people need the armory to resist them. They need the arguments to resist them. So, for instance, when people say, we are aging societies, and that is why we need to import a lot of people all the time to make our societies rich. This argument you hear all the time, as if, by the way, only we in Europe age. As if nobody else in the world ages, and when they come here, they remain miraculously young and just support us. And they never work out, they never explain the economics they're really thinking of this. They never bother with it. So all of these arguments, one by one, need to be, and I think I have, dissected. Because people need to know the arguments that we're all going to need in the years ahead to explain why we should not be abolishing our culture. And that's why I wanted to come back to what's happening here in the Netherlands. Because, as I say, when I used to come here, I used to return to London filled with ominous feelings. And I would always say to people, you know, what's happening there is very, very bad. The self-censorship, the censorship, the violent censorship, this is a very, very bad sign for any society. And I have to say, not just because we're on a beautiful Dutch day, weirdly in a race course by the sea, which is always a place to feel optimistic. But also, I do think I've changed my own views on some of this. My book is very, very bleak in some ways, in a lot of ways. But I also say in this, we have to think about the answers to these questions that our generation has been given. We have to try to think about what the ways out of this are, and as I say, what the refutation is of the lies that have become embedded. And my own view has become that country by country, this is going to be different. We say, what's going to be the fate of Europe? What's going to be the future of Europe? And so on. And it's very hard to judge some of these things because they turn all the time. A few months ago, Angela Merkel could still tell off the Central and Eastern European countries, and a telling off from Angela Merkel meant something. Now Angela Merkel is begging for her political life from the countries she used to tell off. Mrs. Merkel is now an immediate political threat to her political life because of Mr. Salvini in Italy. Total turning around of the tables. In different countries, it's going to turn out differently. In my view, the things I describe in my book, the things I describe in The Strange Death of Europe, there are some countries I think, I don't know how you get out of this. I don't know how you get out of the problem that several generations of politicians have given you. I don't know. I don't see how you get out of it well. But there are other places where that's different. Now, in my country, it's very, very tricky because our political system, among other things, is very, very rigid. People talk about breaking the political system in Britain, but it's two parties that rely on a voter base that basically doesn't exist, but turns out in elections to vote for them. And nothing seems able to break it. No interloper can come about. Even a party like UKIP that made 4 million votes got one parliamentary seat. So you look at this scene, it's very, very hard to see how you could break it. But in this country, sometimes for the worse, I have to say, because you have very strange coalitions sometimes that we can't understand, sometimes for the worse, but also for the better, your system has an amazing thing which I plead with you to take advantage of, which is that it can and does respond to the people. Now, we in Britain had one vote 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, 2 years ago. We had one vote, which was the largest turnout we'd ever had in any election, where the British people turned out and said they wanted to leave the European Union. And we spent 2 years since watching our political class locating their own feet and then firing. But in this country, you have a responsive political system. And in this country, when somebody says, I don't like what is happening, you can get involved in something. You can have a say in your own future. You have a role in the destiny of your country. Politics isn't for other people, which is what it is in some countries. But it isn't like that here. And I have, by the way, one very, very good example of that who's sitting in the front row. Because I saw Thierry at a speech of mine in this country maybe 14 years ago, something like that. And I think he asked a very intelligent question. I thought, that's a smart person. And I'm not just saying that. I thought, that's interesting. He's got a lot of interesting ideas. And that smart young person grows up into a slightly older smart person and turns out to be able to help found a political party that now, as you see, is able to do extraordinary things in this country and is able to have an extraordinary future. And that's just one person getting themselves involved in the future of their nation. And that, I have to say before I hand over to you for a couple of quick questions, that, to my mind, is one of the most exciting things about this country. People say to me, you seem very downbeat about Germany. I think, is there any reason not to feel downbeat about Germany? People say you seem very, you're very pessimistic about Greece. I think, Sometimes I feel very pessimistic about my own country. But a country in which people like you can get involved and have a say in your future is a country that's not only worth getting involved in, but a country worth fighting for. And that's why it's a great pleasure to be here. I will put myself at the mercy of any question you want, and please make them as loud and brief as possible. Gentleman there. You're also going to have to shout over the cars, which is...
Oh, just wait. Excuse me, Mr. Douglas. Oké, vertel even wie je bent, waar je vandaan komt, ook niet onbelangrijk.
Good afternoon, my name is Jeroen van Dijk and I'm a student of International Relations in Leiden at the moment. You talked about the length of a person's political memory. Some people not remembering great events because they're simply not old enough and they weren't engaged in politics at the time. You also talked about censorship and self-censorship and how that worries you in the Netherlands. And I was wondering where you think this tradition, well, insofar as it is a tradition of self-censorship, where it comes from, where does it originate?
Well, that's a very good question. There's a lot of possibilities, but let me give you what I think is the most plausible and the best. I think it comes from a very good place. It comes from a desire to be nice. And, let me say, of all of the desires and instincts we have, that's one of the better ones. We have very, very diverse, pluralistic societies these days. And let me put it this way. If I'm talking to one other person, it's possible that what I say might be disagreed with by that other person. It's possible. Maybe let's say a 50-50 chance. If there's 10 people, there's at least one thing I'm going to say. Me being me, there might be 10 things I say immediately that they're going to disagree with. Expand that out to hundreds of people, thousands of people, all people increasingly with very different backgrounds, not just the different backgrounds everyone used to have, socioeconomic, class, everything like that, but also different racial backgrounds, different religious backgrounds. It becomes almost impossible not to offend someone with anything you say. And now, almost anything you say, even things that were perfectly sensible. Oh, I don't know, for instance, I think men are different from women, possibly. I don't know. What? What are you talking about? So no one says it. I think that there are different values that come from different religions. How dare you? Okay, so basically what it is you want to be nice, you want everyone to get along, so it ends up you don't say anything. Or you say, I don't know, I like puppies. Okay, we can all agree that puppies are... you have this meaningless political discussion because everyone's trying to get along. It's an understandable instinct. The problem is, we've ended up in what I describe as being the movement from empire to umpire. We used to have empires and then we feel terrible about them and some good reason and some bad reason and so on and so forth. And so we decide basically our societies aren't really societies. What we will be is a kind of umpire. And we'll have lots of people with different beliefs and so on. And we'll kind of just, oh, that's interesting. Well, that person thinks this and this person thinks that. And, Umpire societies, maybe they don't last very long. Who knows? We're undergoing an experiment in it. It's a very dangerous experiment to do. I would say making an experiment with everything that's worth, it's like throwing all your money in one stock. So I think it starts from there. And I don't think we should be terribly embarrassed about that. And I think we should be in some ways very proud of it. But the point of all of this is, what's the point where you stop? Where's the point where you say, actually, it's more important that I hold an adherence to the truth than it is that I'm simply polite to everyone? Gentleman at the back, and I don't. Okay, why don't I take a quick go. One. Okay, we'll do three very quickly. As long as nobody gives their life stories, we'll get this done.
Hi, I have one question. At some point you said that the media tells us lies every day regarding immigration. And you gave me one example. You said that our population is aging and that in general immigrants tend to be much younger. Mm-hmm. Both of these are not lies, in principle. You could say it's not a good argument, but it's not an outright lie. Could you give me an example of an actual lie that is being told by the media?
Sure. Oh, every day. Let me give you an obvious example. We can get into that one. I have a chapter in my book on the aging population thing with the specifics on the crazy lie, the lie that this is. But let me just give you one example that happens all the time. It's just happened here with the discussion, in fact, it just happened in Germany for the first time, the transformation of asylum seekers into migrants. Okay? Look, I saw this all firsthand. For the whole of 2015, the newspapers said all these people fleeing war are trying to come into Europe and they're being stopped from coming into Europe. And I say, what are you talking about? Sub-Saharan Africa is a terrible place. I've traveled a fair bit around it. Okay, I've seen lots of the terrible things that people live. It's an awful socioeconomic situation. Why do you need to blur the boundary between somebody fleeing a war and somebody fleeing a bad socioeconomic situation? Only for one reason, that you want to say that basically, whether you're fleeing a war or whether you're fleeing poverty, Europe can be the answer to your dreams. And you can answer whatever it is you want to answer here. That's the lie that was told daily and is still told by a lot of the press. They totally misrepresent. Even when the Vice President of the European Commission says most of the people who've arrived, 60% at least, he said, Frans Timmermans, at least 60% have no right to be in Europe. And everyone continues with the lie. And that's a lie with serious consequences. Okay, it might not be a lie with serious consequences for all of the politicians and the press who make the lie. It's a very serious consequence as a society that's got to mop that up, that's got to deal with that. And it's a very serious problem if you actually do care about sometimes giving people asylum for genuine reasons, as I do. It's a very big problem if you've ended up warming up a public with the idea that basically there's no difference between these things. That's a lie with consequences, and it's still done every day. Very quickly, the gentleman there, and then I'll have to, I think, hand over the microphone to someone. Gentleman there, and then gentleman here.
Yes. My name is Michael de Wilde. I come from Delft, and I heard Frans Timmermans say something in the European Parliament. He said that Europe will diverse, or we will have war. And I
will have war.
Yes, and I think diversity is very important. However, to maintain that diversity, I think we have to maintain our cultures. What is your standpoint on that?
He said if we don't have diversity, we have war.
Yes, that's what he said.
That's a crazy thing even for him to say. What does that even mean? What about the possibility you have diversity and war? What about that? What about that possibility? I mean, this is another embedding of an outright lie. Again, the only explanation you can have for this is if you change your country so radically, maybe you'll end up feeling you don't have anything worth fighting for. Maybe it's something like that. Okay, but my view is that this is a continuation of something that is pushed by people who recognize that they may have been making historic mistakes. Look at Angela Merkel at the moment. She made this historic mistake in 2015. She can't say sorry for it. Why? Because if you say, whoops, I'm so sorry, Germany, I've landed you a massive issue that's going to be with you for a couple of generations. That one's hard to get over. So people dig down, they embed. You know, everyone who studied, there's a fascinating study from Harvard a couple of years ago on what happens when somebody who's got the wrong, a totally, actually erroneous view, a wrong view on a factual issue. What happens when that person meets the actual truth? Now, you and I might think, well, it'd be nice if that person, when they meet the truth, corrects themselves. That's sort of what we assume. It's not true. The studies show that repeatedly, when people who have an absolutely incorrect view come across the truth, they double down on the lie. And that is exactly what is going on. And by the way, any of you who are married or in relationships, most of you might be in some relationship, will know this. It works like that in relationships too. If you're right about something, and your partner thinks they're right about something, and you turn out to be wrong, you very rarely say, you got me. It tends to be you sulk, somewhere down the line, pretend you said something else in the past anyway, and you try to get over it that way. Okay, it rings a bell. It's the same in politics. Well, I've got to get the other, but it entirely depends what you mean by diversity. If by diversity you mean ever faster and larger amounts of immigration, then no. If it means diversity of opinion, then possibly. Possibly, yeah. But that's not what they're talking about when I hear this term. We're going to have to continue the conversation afterwards another time, but because I did say the gentleman there. Yeah.
Hello. So you
Hi.
talked about how do you say it? That the damn it, I forgot the English word for it, but censorship. Yeah. So you talked about censorship, and I would like to know some general thoughts about like Tommy Robinson, since it's also applicable to your country, and I would like to know if you have some thoughts about that topic.
Let me tell you what I think is general. I wrote about this a few weeks ago in the National Review in America, but let me tell you what I think is actually going on. I think, and it goes back slightly to the gentleman's question there, I think that there is when you realize that you have got some very serious problems in your society, it's very hard to deal with the primary issue. What is easy to deal with is a secondary issue. So let me give you the example. For years, the thing that Tommy Robinson's been particularly vocal about, the grooming gangs, the rape gangs, they're sometimes called Asian rape gangs, which itself is a problematic phrase, okay? These went on for years. We have report after report from the British government, the British authorities, admitting this is going on. Council workers who knew it was going on. Police who knew it was going on. All the local authorities who knew what was going on. All the local MPs who knew what was going on, okay? Every single part of society failed. Every single part. The police, the official reports will say the same thing, were worried about being politically incorrect. The council workers were worried they'd be accused of racism, and so on and so on and so forth. So you have by now, and I'm not exaggerating this is all of the stuff of the official findings, thousands and thousands of young girls from across the UK have been raped by these gangs. Now that's a bad thing to have on your conscience. That's the sort of thing that should keep any decent person awake at night if they had even a tiny role in allowing that to go on. But they don't address what allowed that to go on. We keep seeing this tendency to get the secondary problem and go really hard for that. And the secondary problem always is the people who vocally, often wrongly, often crassly, all sorts of other things, identify in opposition to that. And they come down, they crack down on that as hard as anything. You saw, by the way, a very quick example of that. You saw that in Germany with Angela Merkel. When the Pegida protests began, I didn't agree with them. Like a lot of people, I was keeping an eye on what they were doing and so forth. What does Angela Merkel use her New Year message to do? To attack Pegida. She says, these people in Pegida have coldness in their hearts. Okay, it's very easy to go for this. It's very easy to go for the people who are responding to it. Much harder is to go to the thing those people are trying to raise attention about. And, you know, in all of these cases, there are things that can be said that are critical and should be. But this seems to me to be the pattern we keep on seeing. And you see it here. My friend Mark Stein put it very beautifully in the Danish parliament a few years ago when we were doing an event there. He said that the most famous Danish story is of the boy who, the emperor's new clothes. And he was sort of, Danish hero. Everyone liked to think they were the boy who, if they saw the emperor had no clothes, would say, look, the emperor's naked. And Mark pointed out that in modern Europe, the boy who noticed the emperor had no clothes would be a fool to mention it, and if he did, he'd probably be clubbed to death by the rest of the crowd. There's this weird tendency to shut down the very people who are pointing to it. You know, there's that old joke, the old saying that if that the only thing you can't say in free speech is, you can't shout fire in a crowded theatre. And I always say there is an exception to that, which is if there is a fire, okay? In which case it might be a quite wise idea. But every single time anyone says, look, I'm identifying this problem, everyone cracks down on them. And I just say the same thing always. How about you save some of the energy for shutting down all the people who you think are saying the wrong phrases and so on? Just expend a bit of that energy on the people who are preaching hatred in your society. Direct it at that, and the secondary thing will never come up, because you'll be dealing with it. But for the time being, we're in this weird period where the cost of speaking up remains disproportionately high. And I think that has to change. And the one thing I would say in finishing is this. There is always an assumption that somebody else is going to change that situation for you. And it's never the case. It is never the case. It is only people speaking up for themselves. It's only you. It's only the individual who says, I think this is a lie. I think this is wrong. It's only that changes it. The household cavalry, the cavalry never come in on free speech horses. Never is the case. And that's why I always say the same thing to people. You have to have your own role in this. You speak to your friends, you're honest with people, you tell the truth. You tell the truth in your own life, in whatever way you can, and that's the best way to fight back against this. But it's got to be done.
Mr. Murray, wait for a sec. Just one question. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming here. So we didn't play the World Cup. You play against Colombia. So give us some advice for the betting. Halftime, England-Colombia.
This is like a nightmare. You have touched on the subject I know least about in the entire world.
Okay, leave it.
You found the one person from England who doesn't have a view on this matter.
Okay, we leave it. Have a good trip back home. Thank you very much for coming. Give him a big hand, Mr. Douglas Murray.